to an exciting, fantastic, amazing bonus episode of Oh My Word. And today, we actually have a different kind of guest on, which is also going to be really exciting because now that I found out about this, I think it's something that we're all going to have to keep track of. It aligns very much to our regular episodes, so this is very exciting. We have on today someone, her name is Tiffany Brannan, and she is, well, with her sister, the founder of the Pure Entertainment Preservation Society. PEPS, Save the Arts in America. So Tiffany, welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, great. It's so nice to have you. So before we explain what exactly it is that you do, let's give everyone please a little bit of background about where are you coming from so we know how we even ended up here.
Well, I was homeschooled growing up, so I didn't really know a lot about current culture, and my family always loved watching old movies. So I'd only seen about a handful of recent films. I loved watching movies from the 1940s and 50s, and I just thought they were so nice and clean and wholesome, and I just thought, the world was better back then. That's what my family believed, and they all looked so pretty and seemed like such nice people, it seemed easy to believe. But then when I was about 15, I found out about the Motion Picture Production Code. I just happened to be looking on Wikipedia about a random film, and I saw a reference to it, and I was very curious, so I looked at an article about it, and I saw, this was a set of guidelines that existed that were written in the 1930s. The first thought that occurred to me was, that explains why some of the few early 1930s movies I have seen are a little dark, a little different. And I saw that it lasted through the 50s and then died during the 60s, and I thought that explains the change in films that I've noticed in the 60s. And I was interested, but I didn't give it too much thought at the time. But then later that summer, when I was 16, my sister was working on an English project, because since we were both homeschooled, we both were very advanced in school. So she was actually finishing her schooling when she was, I was 15 at the time. This was 2016. So she was 12, and she was in her junior year of high school. I had already graduated, and so I was helping her with her English project. We were working through an English course, and we needed different topics for different essays and paragraphs, and we naturally were getting very interested in the 1930s then, because we had both developed an interest in an actor named Lou Ayres, who was a 1930s actor, so suddenly the 1930s was our favorite decade. So we were studying it, and we started studying the production code, finding out more about it, and pre-code films, which were made before then. And then for her major research paper at the end of the year, we decided to make it about the motion picture production code and how it impacted America. So that was the beginning of the whole thing for us. We wrote this paper, and it became our passion.
Wow. So just to explain for those who don't know, what is the motion picture production code? And yes. Also, does it align, or is it the same thing as, or is it related to the Hays Code, which also existed in early Hollywood?
That's a very good question. As a matter of fact, the production code is the Hays Code.
Okay.
But I don't use that term generally because it was written in 1930 by two gentlemen, Martin Quigley, who was a newspaper man about films. He had a lot of film trade papers, and Father Daniel A. Lord, who was a Catholic priest as well as an educator and an author himself, so he was a very learned and accomplished man. Will Hays was the head of the Motion Picture Producers and Association of America. That's the MPPDA. That organization was founded back in 1922 to cover up a lot of and help with the scandals that had happened in the 20s, because Hollywood was getting a really bad reputation. So you can think of it as a goodwill or public relations organization for Hollywood, and that organization still exists today.
Right,
it was renamed for the Motion Picture Association of America in 1945, and just last year they renamed it to the Motion Picture Association, MPA. So, and if you see the modern ratings on any film, that's the same organization. So Will Hays, who was called the movie czar, and he was a very important political figure. He was a postmaster general at one point. He thought that something needed to be done to regulate content, because even back in the 1920s, they wanted to put risque costumes, themes, and there were censor boards all over the country. And even though films could basically include any content they wanted, the censor boards would have a field day with them. So that kind of kept them in line. But then this code was written, and it's a set of rules about decency in pictures. So there are 11 different sections. One's about crime, one's about vulgarity, profanity, costumes, dances. It basically covers everything from not making murderers look sympathetic to dances which can't be suggestive or stimulate the baser element, to not disrespecting religion. So although some people think of this code as being religion, it's based on what they considered at the time basic morality, which is Judeo-Christian principles on which our country was founded. And the principle wasn't that every film had to be religious per se, but it had to make the audience know that evil is wrong and good is right. So you couldn't ridicule anybody's religion, and that goes for Buddhism as well as for Christianity, even though there wasn't too much of that in mainstream America at the time. So that was the code. But after it was written, Martin Quigley, it was mainly his idea, so it was suggested to Mr. Hayes, and he thought it was a great idea, and that's why it's called the Hayes Code. And he actually presented it to the filmmakers as something he had written, because he didn't want the Jewish filmmakers or America, which had a large Protestant element, to know that it had Catholic origins, because he thought that they might think it was then some sort of Catholic control, when the principles were really for everyone. So it was adopted, but for the next 4 years, there was a very ineffective board to enforce it, the Studio Relations Committee. So they would just suggest they make changes, but they didn't have any authority. So that's what the pre-code era is. And if you've ever seen those gangster films or movies with a lot of drinking and tough women like Babyface and Public Enemy, Scarface, those are pre-code films, and they're not exactly like modern films, but they're pretty strange. They contain some very surprising elements. But then in 1934, after years of prohibition, and prohibition was just ending, and there was beginning to be an uprising, and the Catholic Legion of Decency was complaining about all the immorality in films, and people were suddenly demanding clean movies. And then President Roosevelt began warning that maybe he would start a federal regulation or even censorship board. So in desperation, the filmmakers said, we really need to enforce this code. So then they founded the Production Code Administration in July of 1934 with Joseph I. Breen as the head of it, and that was the beginning of the code being enforced. I call that the Breen era, and that's really when the code started making code films.
Right, because Hollywood is unique in that it self-regulates, but self-regulates also means they were effective in making sure the government wasn't there to regulate them, but then that also means that they make up their own regulations, which a lot of people, even if someone who does watch modern film, you can see how PG-13 ratings have changed, PG ratings have changed, because they're making the decisions on their own.
Exactly.
Yeah, so going back now to that a little bit, because the code, according to what you're saying, the code was basically fully in effect from mid-1930s-ish till about the 1960s. But I still think I've seen a lot of older films, not all of them, but a lot of them, and there still seems to be a progression. You have a lot of, let's say, romantic comedies which you see then, or a lot of it's based on wit and lines, and not like today where it's based on just, I guess, hotness, which is a little disappointing because it's much more fun to have witty dialogue than to just have hotness. But there are films like a film like Gilda that gets in the later mid 1940s, and that film was not like that was kind of it's not suggestive, but kind of is. So I don't know, like how long was the code really effectively in effect for? Because you are seeing that certain films are still getting in that may or may not seem to really comply with that. Does that make sense?
Yes, that's a very good point. The code was effectively in place between 1934 and 1954. That was when Joseph I. Breen was the head of the production code, and I call that the Breen era, so I consider there really only those 20 years. After that, Jeffrey Sherlock took over, that was his assistant, and he had always been sort of a bad code enforcer because there were 8 or 9 men on the board the whole time, and he was not a good enforcer, and he allowed the code to steadily decay. So that's why you see films like Baby Dolls, Some Like It Hot, and the risque movies of the 50s and later 50s and 60s, ultimately leading to the rating system in 1968, because by that point, the code was so ridiculous, it had been so badly enforced that it looked like it was just trash. Now, you referred to seeing a movie from the 40s. Now, I've heard things about Gilda. I must say I haven't actually seen it yet because there were about 8,000 code films made. It's my goal to watch them all, but I haven't seen them all yet.
Yeah.
I haven't seen that one, but there is such a thing as, well, I've kind of come up with it, the code classification system. Now, the idea is that every code film, especially from the Breen era, is completely decent. But that isn't necessarily true, because there were 8 men on the board. Some of them weren't as good, like Jeffrey Sherlock was a member of the PCA and for the whole time, and sometimes the filmmakers would fight harder, so Mr. Breen didn't have personal control over every single film. So there are some films which aren't good code films. Like I say, the best thing, you have a good code film. It means it's completely code compliant. Then I consider perfect code films, which aren't just code compliant, but they deal with difficult topics, or they have an extra inspiring quality. But below that, there are fair code films, which have just like a couple of problems. You're saying, or poor code films, which have a few more problems, or even the strange non-code films. It's very odd when you discover one of these. I've only seen a few, but there are some where you see a movie and say, how did this get past the code?
Right.
It doesn't seem like a code film at all, and there are some of them, especially in 1941 and 1942, because in 1941, Mr. Breen was getting really fed up because a lot of people were starting to really criticize him about some of the more daring films he had allowed in 1940. I think that he was just doing the right thing because you can have more mature topics if done correctly, but they were really beginning to criticize him, and so he said, if you don't like what I'm doing, I'm going to leave. So he actually left and went to be the president. Actually, it was the vice president, but in charge of production at RKO Radio Pictures, because the studios were always asking him to have a job. So he went and was in charge of RKO for a whole year. And during that time, it's amazing, some of the films that came out during that time. I Married an Angel with Jeanette MacDonald, Nelson Eddy, The Palm Beach Story, Claudette Colbert and Joel Macria, Two-Faced Woman with Greta Garbo. And some of these movies, they are really risque, and they almost seem like later 50s films, and that's because Mr. Breen wasn't there, and it just gives you a little glimpse into why things fell apart in the 50s, because there are lots of different discussions. People say it was foreign films, it was television, it was changing times, but that shows you this was before television or foreign films. It's just Jeffrey Sherlock's bad leadership, because you can see it happening in 1942, and it just gives you an idea. What if Mr. Breen hadn't come back? He actually got fired from RKO, so he came back. But it gives you an idea, if he hadn't, what would have happened in the later 40s? By 1950, probably would have been like it was in 1960. So 4-letter words all over the place, really risque costumes. It's kind of gives you just a little glimpse into what might have been and how things would have gone downhill so much sooner. It's a bit of a stretch, but I almost wonder if we could have won World War II without the code's help to keep people being patriotic and the American spirit.
Yeah, that's interesting, because most of the films that you see from the wartime, either someone's in uniform or they have an explanation for why they're not in uniform, but there's always a line about the war in there, like always. Mm-hmm. And it's always supportive of, and if somebody's not supportive in the film, they're not looked upon very well. So, yeah, that's interesting. Well, and then because also you have, in the 60s, that's when the Supreme Court, I think, passed the ruling that things like porn or nudity are considered free speech. So that probably wrecked the code also, because film
was it the Miracle Act, which said that films were protected by the First Amendment?
Yes, I think. I don't remember.
Is that what you referred? Yeah, that was actually 1952. And that's the one thing people say that helped the code fall apart. But actually, that isn't accurate but it's a good point because people always talk about it. Right. That helped break down the censorship boards in America, which really bothered Mr. Breen for his whole career, because he would work 7 days a week for hours to make a film code compliant. Then he'd release it, and some stubborn old censor in Kansas would butcher it. So in some ways, it kind of undermined. It was both. It was like the two-edged sword. It helped because he would say, if you don't enforce the code, if you don't do this, you're going to get murdered in Wichita by the censor boards. But on the other hand, sometimes they would get murdered in Wichita anyway. So, and then they'd be like, well, you said that we would. So, yeah, it was difficult. Censor boards were something that basically everybody at the code hated. Martin Quigley, who wrote the code, hated censorship because he said, you can't take a movie that's fully made and then cut it apart and think you're going to get a good movie if it's been made dirty in the first place.
Right.
because he said, back in 1915, when there were just small silent films, he said, we need something that will make films decent when they're being made. And so that's why the idea of the code was they reviewed every script, every costume, every line, every song before the film was even made. They helped them during the filmmaking process so that they wouldn't have this beautifully made film and then say, all right, cut out 15 minutes, because that ruins films. You can't censor effectively. Once in a while they'd say, all right, trim that scene if they didn't heed their warnings earlier. But the Miracle Act was the start of the censorship boards going away, but it wasn't until the late 60s that they were. And sometimes the censor boards were unreasonable, like in the South. There was this censor named Binford, Mr. Binford, and he was in the Deep South, and they would call his process of censoring Binfordizing. And he was really strict, but not necessarily about moral issues. He was more about racial issues. If there was anything that was like miscegenation or even black and white children in the same schoolroom, he really was strong about enforcing the old Jim Crow laws of segregation in the South. And California and New York and the rest of the country wasn't that far back in terms of racism. They were much farther along in being progressive.
Right.
But he would keep that. He would just butcher films. Now, sometimes they wouldn't care, but sometimes, if that's why Hollywood is maybe a little bit slower with showing racial integration than we might like, a lot of the blame can be given to Binford because he was very powerful. They didn't want to make a film that they knew would enrage him, and he would either censor or outright ban a film, and he was in an important area. But then the terrible thing is that a lot of the censors, like Binford was a troublemaker, but he still was a powerful censor, and he retired in 1955, like right when the Sherlock era was happening. Like that's when they needed the censors to kind of keep things in line, but that's when they all retired. So that's the main thing about the Supreme Court case. It really was more about what was happening in Hollywood than anything that the Supreme Court or censor boards could do.
Right. Well, that's also an example of how something might be legally correct, but that doesn't mean that it's necessarily either morally correct or it's not necessarily a good thing just because it's legally correct. And that's something that, I guess the court is all about what the legal aspect is, and then we have to make the decision about what's actually the decent aspect of it. And then, but going back for a second, you said that you kind of made your own sort of ratings or categories for code films. Can you give an example? I think you mentioned 4 different categories: the ones that are perfect or above or kind of below code. So can you give just off the top of your head, if there's an example of one film for each, they give an example of, and maybe a line. Just a quick thing, so we can get some context of what you're referring to. Yeah,
I can do that. All right, let's see. A good code film, I'd say just one that a lot of people would know, The Wizard of Oz. It's very wholesome. It's decent. It's about a nice young girl, and I'd say basically there are no code violations. Now, it doesn't have to be as much of a family film as that. There are a lot of other films. But just any film where you could say, there was nothing that would bother me or any other reasonable individual in that film. That's a good code film. A perfect code film is a little beyond that, and there are a couple of different ones. You could have one that's just really inspiring and uplifting, like, Goodbye, Mr. Chips from 1939. It's about a school teacher who devotes his life, and it really inspires you to want to be a better person. So that's why I call that a perfect code film. Or there's the other type of perfect code film, which is something like Casablanca from 1943 is a good example. It handles some, you could say, difficult topics. There's a romance between a married woman and another man, World War II, Nazis. It's a very dramatic and serious and mature film, yet it's handled so well and so delicately that anybody can watch it, and it's decent and it's wholesome. They did a very good job. And if that hadn't been under the code, it would be like now PG-13 or R. They would have just gone wild, but they didn't because it was code. So they did a really good job with that. So that's another perfect code film. Now, a fair code film, it's something where there are just a couple of problems. I will say Sunset Boulevard is a good example of that. From 1950. Now, I love that film, and I think they did a great job on a very difficult topic, but there are 2 things which I consider code violations. The first thing is very minor. In the office, a producer burps very quietly. Now, burping was not considered a nice thing to show, and so it was technically forbidden by the code, but for some reason they included that strange little elements, so that's an objection. And the more major thing is the film opens with seeing William Holden's character floating in the swimming pool after he has been shot, and his eyes are open. Now, generally they didn't want filmmakers to show corpses with their eyes open under the code because it's kind of disgusting. But the strange thing is, after they fish him out, his eyes are closed, so they really should have just had his eyes closed. So that's why that's a fair code film, because other than that, it's a really great movie. There are just those two little problems. And for a poor code film, that's where there are some more substantial problems. For a famous example, I'll say Gone with the Wind. Now, I hate to be critical of that film because they worked so hard to try to make that really difficult novel into a movie, and they did a good job. But David Selznick was a bit stubborn. He remained with some elements that really weren't necessary. The two main points being the famous line, he does say a four-letter word, right, Scarlet, and that is technically in violation of the code. Now, they didn't just, get away with it. It was a special exemption. They went to the New York office to discuss giving them this special exemption. Sometimes they say it's because World War II was beginning to be more discussed on the radio at that time, so people were starting to say four-letter words more, and so he demanded an exemption. They also say they cut out a lot of other profanity in that film, plus they cut out some racial slurs, so that was allowed. But that still is a code violation. And there is a scene where this Union soldier comes into their house and he gets shot right in the face, and that's pretty violent. So other than that, it's a good film, but those two things, I would say, make it a poor code film. And then there is the non-code film. We touched on that briefly. It can either be from the non-code era, which is 41 to 42, and it has to have been released between, I believe it's May of 1941 and May of 1942. It could be from that era, and I mentioned I Married an Angel, which contains the rather bizarre premise of a man who, well, it technically is just a dream, but it's still strange. He dreams that he falls in love with this angel who has these big wings, really ridiculous wings, and then he marries her. But there's very suggestive elements, like after the night they get married, she's like, my wings are gone. It's a bit too pointed the way she's sitting in the bed. Right. Although they are married, you don't want to be too suggestive about that. And there are some really risque costumes, some strange dancing, and on top of that, it's a very poor film. And then, but they don't just have to be from that era. There are ones from other time periods too. Anytime throughout the code, I always say, Jeff worked on this one, Jeffrey Sherlock, and that probably isn't necessarily true, but I have been able to find these actual files on a lot of films, and every time I have found a non-code film, I have found that Joseph Breen, in fact, was not one of the two people who worked on it. So pretty much non-code means non-Breen. But another good example is The Adventures of Robin Hood from 1938. It's an Errol Flynn and Olivia de Havilland film. It's a very famous and beloved movie, an early Technicolor from Warner Brothers, but they made some huge errors on that. Firstly, it's very violent. There's so many arrows that stick right into people's bodies, you see, in that film. Some violent lines, plus two major errors with the clergy. It was a rule that they couldn't depict clergy as either comical or evil. And in that film, they have a goofy Friar Tuck and a sinister bishop. So they really made some huge errors in that one, and somebody let them get away with it. And with all that violence, I imagine Jeffrey Sherlock would have said it was cathartic, because he liked that phrase. It comes from Old Greek, and it means to be violent in the point of cleansing, like violence to cleanse. And that can be used to put in a little too much violence sometimes. So he probably thought all that violence was cleansing. So that's a non-code film. So I hope that gives you an example of the different classifications.
Yeah, and just to clarify this, and then to speak about other things, sometimes you have in some of the early films, you'll see someone get shot, but then there's no blood splatter or anything like that. Is that considered like the violence level of the code, or is that still not in compliance with the code?
That's about what the code would allow. There are many scenes where you see, whether they be crime films or war films, where you see somebody get shot, like he clasps his hand to his stomach and then falls down. That generally is considered acceptable. Like you said, if there isn't blood, that usually is what was allowed by the code. Now, there are times in the code where you don't actually see the person getting shot. I think they would prefer to not see the person getting shot, but there were many times they allowed that, because there's an old story about a priest who was listening to people complaining about movies being bad and saying, "Oh, we make crime. All the films have nothing but crime and sin and romance." And he said, "Well, what would you like them to make movies about?" So they have to have some. To say you can't show any shooting, that would be basically saying all you can make is
Mother
Mickey
Goose.
Mouse and Andy Hardy films. I mean, they wanted to let them do something.
Right. Well, so then, I know this is already later, but when you're seeing like certain, let's say like Hitchcock films, and there was a big deal, I think it was with Psycho, where the first time they showed like a toilet flush, and the son was kind of, I think they were throwing a note down the toilet, something like that. So is that already considered, everyone thought like, wow, look at how we're progressing here. Is that considered no, big code violation, or that's just like, okay, whatever?
Yeah, that was actually a huge code violation. That was Psycho 1960, Hitchcock. So that was 6 years into the Sherlock era. Of course, that was not the first time that a toilet was shown, because I've seen a few other Sherlock films. There's one called No Time for Sergeants in 1957, where they actually show a toilet in that one too. And there's another one, Follow That Dream is 1961. Well, there's at least the one from 57, but that was one of the first mainstream films to show a toilet, and that was a code violation, because if you have ever noticed if you see a bathroom in a code film, there is no toilet in that bathroom. Now, it could be that it's in the place where you don't see it, but They were building the set, so they just never put toilets in because it was considered vulgar or in poor taste. People didn't want to see that kind of thing now. And it's come to a point now that a lot of people think that's a little silly, because after 50 years of bathroom humor, it's not shocking anymore to a lot of young people. But I know a few older people who are a little embarrassed if other people want to joke around about toilet paper or something like that. It isn't a nice topic, so that was far from the biggest problem in Psycho, but it was an issue, and yes, so that was a code violation. Now, one interesting time, Grapes of Wrath in 1940, which I consider a perfect code film because it was such a wonderful capturing of the Okie plight. There is a moment in that time where you actually hear a toilet flush, but you don't actually see it. Despite that, I still think it's a perfect code film because they're showing that these children have had such a miserable, or at least poor, destitute life. They've never even seen indoor plumbing before.
Right.
So they're frightened when they hear this sound, but you don't see the toilet, and they're just playing around. So I think that's all right, but that's basically that issue.
Yeah, we let that one slide. Right. It's actually fun, just a side comment. It's funny when you originally started, that you said that you thought people were better, or society maybe was better, 30s, 40s, 50s. Like, the 40s wasn't exactly a great time for people. The early 40s when the war is going on. But I understand that you meant more that societal norms and the way we treat each other.
Right.
And you saw a lot more respect between people, insofar as the way, like men and women, the way they treat each other as a general rule, or what was allowed. But now moving over, so Pure Entertainment Preservation Society. So what does that do? Like, what is it and what does it do?
Well, right now, it's basically a blog. It's a WordPress blog. We started October 17th of 2016. At first, I was really excited about making it an activist group, trying to encourage people to write letters to the editor. Of course, I never had any views or anything because I was just getting started. But then I started making it more about classic films themselves. And I started participating in blogathons and other blogging events like that and putting pictures in, and I realized I got a lot more views by doing that than just being causey all the time. I still do try to always have my message, but I write at least 2 articles each week, sometimes 3 or 4. And it's basically, the motto is Save the Arts in America. It's about trying to reform not just film, but opera, ballet, and theater. It actually, the first idea before I even found out about the code was to have some sort of an organization to cleanse opera, because I've been training to be an opera singer since I was about 10. I've been singing since I was about 4, and I really love opera. I've always wanted to be an opera singer, but I realized when I was about 11 that films have kind of influenced everything, including opera, because we went to the Metropolitan Opera, and saw a production of my favorite opera, Giulio Cesare, by Handel, which was written back in the 1700s, yet they had modernized it so bizarrely. Sometimes it was Bollywood dancing, sometimes it was the 1920s flapper, sometimes she was pretending to shoot a machine gun. It was bizarre and really goofy, but it also was so far from what Handel, the composer, wanted. And so I realized that every professional opera company is modernizing operas so terribly. This trend started in Europe, but it spread to America, and they call it meta-theater here in America, and it's really terrible. So I thought there needs to be purity in entertainment, decency as well as some sort of standard and ethics. You can't take something somebody else wrote and think you can just do it any way you want. That's as bad as censorship. I mean, if people hate that, yet they think it's all right to have creative license, well, write your own opera. So that's what people do, and I really didn't like that, and I was concerned ballet, because my sister's a ballerina, is going in the same direction. So I thought we need to start some sort of an organization to purify the arts. But then when I found out about the code, I thought that kind of linked everything together, that we could start with films being decent, because that's what's really pervaded society and contributed to things, the moral decay and the lack of ethics and decency, so that people aren't shocked to see in Giulio Cesare, after these two characters got shot, during this duet, the mother and son were taking their fake blood, but it looked very real, and like rubbing it on their faces. They were just wallowing in blood right on the stage, and that's not what Handel wanted. So you can see how people didn't mind it. They thought that kind of thing was funny. So that was really why we started it. But then the focus has become films, and for the past 4 years, we've written a lot of articles. We have about 600 on our website. I write most of them. My sister writes some. I participate in every blogathon I can find, and for those of you who don't know what a blogathon is, it's on blogging, which are people's websites about classic films in this case. One person will host a blogathon, which is a topic. Say theirs was a Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn blogathon quite recently, or actually, yes, quite recently. Oh. And that person said, let's celebrate, it could be in honor of a birthday, a death anniversary, or just because. And she said, we're going to celebrate Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn. So everyone who wanted to participate chose a different film or a different aspect of their lives and then wrote about it on his blog. So each person could join that party as sort of a shared topic, and I do that because it gives me good topics, and I noticed my views really started to climb when I joined my first blogathon a couple of years ago. So now Rebecca and I host a lot of them. Rebecca's my sister, and we've hosted one in September, and now we're hosting one in October, November, and December. So we host them a lot, and that helps to spread the word about PEPS. And I had business cards made up. I try to hand them out to people. So right now, I may not have too big an audience. I have about 415 followers, but I'm very encouraged when other writers, film bloggers, who are especially younger ones, will say, I never even heard about the code until I started reading your articles, but now I love it, because I always knew I liked those old movies, and I liked decency, but I didn't know why I liked those old movies, and that I've informed people about it, and so many people didn't, either they had never heard of the code, or they'd only heard bad things. They heard the code was censorship. They heard that Joseph Breen was a bigot, but now they see Mr. Breen is a kind, wonderful man, and the code as a great thing. So if just 20 people can see it as a good thing, I think that PEPS is starting to make an impact.
Right. Well, do you actually intend or think that Hollywood is ever going to go back to that, or are you just trying to make sure that there's also a large channel for these types of films? Just because I can tell you as a novelist, and I'm writing for teenagers, there are some excellent books out there, and there are some books out there that I can't believe they're writing for teenagers. I can't believe what they're including in it. And, everyone, you're such a prude, you're such this, that, or whatever. And it's like, you could call me whatever you want, but it doesn't mean that the point is wrong. Why is this okay for teenagers? And they're like, because teenagers talk like this. Because teenagers act like this. Because it's in their minds. It's like, well, we shouldn't be reinforcing it. We should be putting other things in their minds.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's kind of like PG-13. I think some of the things they put in those PG-13 films would be more acceptable for a 5-year-old to see than a 13-year-old, because when you're 5, a lot of people don't understand that kind of thing. But by the time you're 13, you're just starting to get it. That you don't need that kind of bad influence. Well, about film, could there ever be a code again? Well, basically the goal of PEPS is to replace the rating system with the code again. It sounds like kind of an impossible dream, and when I think about it, it's like I can't imagine it happening, but I also can't imagine it not happening. I've made it my life work for the last 4 years, so I just have to believe that somehow it will happen again. And I believe it will, because I think there are enough people from different areas who have said that's a great idea, of different ages, who have said I really agree with that. I think that somehow there will be enough of a grassroots movement, hopefully that I could be influential, some of the things I'm trying to do could help, that people will finally say we won't have this anymore, we don't want the rating system anymore, and get rid of the rating system and put a new production code administration in again, and then there could be decency in films once more. And I think that some people think it was just too archaic, like it wouldn't work now.
Right.
But Rebecca and I do something called breening, where we take films that were made outside of the code era and we say how they could have been made under the code when Mr. Breen was there. And in Variety, they always would call it breening, like, oh yes, this film's being breened. So that's what we call it. And we do it from modern films as well. Like right now, Rebecca and I we started back in May. Every month, we breen a different Star Wars film, starting with A New Hope back in 1977, to show that these are really modern films, especially when you get up to the sequels, and they're very popular, very science fiction. They don't seem like what you think a code film would be, yet we make them, hypothetically, code films. Put some more decent costumes on, make some of the aliens less grotesque, a little less violence, and they're great stories. So if a film is a good story, it should survive breening. And if it doesn't survive breening, if it's unbreenable, it can't be that good a story, because that means either it's based on something that's too lurid for all people to enjoy, or it's not based on a strong story at all. It's a really weak plot just held together with violence or suggestiveness or risqueity. There's so many pre-code films that are like that, and I bet there are a lot of modern films that are like that too. So I hope that someday that there will be a new code, and that it will be someday in the near future, because things have gone so far now. It's the natural progression of life for the pendulum to swing back and forth. I think we're coming pretty close to the time when it's going to swing back to decency.
Well, honestly, I will be a very happy person if they finally take teenagers sleeping together out of teenage films, because that is ridiculous. Would you be willing to accept if someone said, okay, we could bring a code back, but it's going to be a modified code because we don't think we could go back to the 30s or the 40s? Is there anywhere that you think, okay, maybe we could allow a little, wiggle room here, or everything is like, no, we have to go back to the code because we have to draw a firm line?
Well, one thing that definitely would be removed is the miscegenation clause, because that wasn't even in the original code. That was added by somebody at the Hayes office because it went along with, like I mentioned, Binford, the bigoted censors at the time.
Right.
But saying that people of different races can't get married or have a romance, that isn't necessary anymore. That was just to go with the societal norms of the time.
Right.
But the thing about the code is that it's remarkably vague. They don't even mention a lot of sins, like they just say perversion, which covers any number of irregularity, if you will. It isn't engraved in stone, and that's what Mr. Breen always said was the beauty of it. It's fluid. It can be used. It can be stretched, but it isn't just like anybody can't enforce it. I mean, anyone with good taste can, but that shows why you can, if you bend it far enough. That's how Sherlock ruined it. If people have good taste, I don't think it needs much modification. I think just pull out miscegenation and then just let it guide people. Of course, like you see in the early code films, the first year or so, they weren't great. Some of them were, but some of them were still a little pre-codish. It could take 5 years to really bring it back to a state where people would want that kind of decency. But just start with, and of course, if there were movies, there would be movies already in production, so they'd only be halfway code films. Right. And there were lots of halfway code films in 1934, like The Merry Widow. That seems like a pre-code film, but technically it was a code film since it was already made. They could just sort of censor it. I'd say if the code came into power, you would just say, let's just give it a pass. This is one of the old ones. We're trying to start fresh, trying to encourage people to do the right thing. Say, let's just start by cutting out all the profanity, cutting out all the violence. I know it would be shocking to some people, but there is a difference between a code film and a G-rated film. There are things that they would have in code films that the rating system wouldn't think are clean enough or whatever for a PG film because they're going by age. So they're trying to make G-rated films immature. And if a film wants to be mature, they'll, like, going back to Star Wars, there are 2 notable instances of profanity in that film. And I found it a little forced, and then I found out that they purposely put in that profanity to be sure they got a PG rating so they wouldn't get a G and only children would come. So that's where you see the fallacy of the rating system.
Yeah.
And like Annie from the 80s, they did the same thing. Both those films, quite frankly, didn't need to try. I don't know about the rating system, but they definitely deserved PG even without the profanity because of the violence and other things. But they purposely, and they do that now. If they're aiming for a PG-13 or an R, they'll put in extra violence, extra profanity, even extra suggestiveness and immorality just to be sure they get that rating they want. And then they have the rules, like saying if you say the worst word more than once, you automatically get R. But I heard about a film that just came out a little while. What was it? I think it was The Fast and Furious, Hobson and Shaw. I was reading the IMDb warnings on that film, and they said there are 5 or 6 usages of the worst word, and it's rated PG-13. So their rules they don't enforce their own rules.
Yeah, and there's another film also that's also a teen film. I don't remember what it's called right now. That also they put in 2 instead of 1 and still got the PG-13 rating. Yeah. No, but that's actually a very good point to show that sometimes because of the way the rating system works, that filmmakers, because of the audience they're trying to reach, will try to add certain elements to reach that audience where they doesn't have to be there. And there are so many times that you see things that you're like, that really doesn't have to be there. But I guess when you're rating it by age and not just by decency, then that's kind of the pitfall of that. So yeah, that's a really interesting point. Yeah. So I guess that seems like right now your biggest thing is to just be talking about it and just get more awareness of it through article writing and through the blogathons and things like that. Or is there anything else right now in motion?
Now that is the biggest thing.
Yeah.
And I am writing for 2 publications now. I have been since last year. I'm writing for the Epoch Times, which is an independent newspaper in print as well as online, and for Shine on Hollywood magazine. Now, the Epoch Times is noted for truth and tradition. A lot of people affiliate it definitely with conservative politics, but it really is nonpartisan. It's just trying to not have any spin on the truth.
Right.
And Shine on Hollywood is strictly non-political and non-religious, but it's just about positivity in Hollywood. And I've written 22 articles now for the Epoch Times, and I write about classic films, and I try to mention the code as often as I can, and that really has brought it to a larger audience. And so many people have sent me comments saying, I read your article in the Epoch Times, and either I know about the code or I just found out about it, and I really was so glad to hear about it. So that is why I'm hoping will really bring some greater awareness, and I try to mention it occasionally in Shine on Hollywood too, and I'm hoping through Shine on Hollywood because there are a lot of red carpet events, and I'm one of the top writers there now. Like going to hopefully if the Golden Globes happen this year, I will get to go. Right. And so I hope that will give me some connections to actually meeting some Hollywood insiders, so it comes to a point where I could tell my ideas to a head of a company, to a mogul, instead of just to interested viewers, because that's the point you have to reach. It's something that the filmmakers have to want it, and the main thing that will appeal to them, of course, is money. I mean, we're not going to say, you want to do the right thing, don't you? You do the right thing. I'm not saying some of them don't have good intentions, but basically all they want is money, and they think that they're making more money. But if you show them, if your biggest films are rated PG-13 and R, you're saying restricted. You're restricting audiences. Why would you not want every film to be that everyone can see it? You know how many more tickets you'll sell? Try to appeal to them on the most basic level, money. So they'll see that it could be so good for them. And that's what it saved all the film companies from bankruptcy during the Great Depression. Because they were going bankrupt and yet being stupid and making films that were so indecent that children weren't going to come and see them. And then suddenly they said, you need to make films for everybody. And so then they were, and then they were the only business that was doing well during the Great Depression, or one of the only. So that, but regarding other ways, I do have one idea that I haven't been able to start yet. I've been working on it for over 2 years now, called the Legion of Scriveners for Reform. It's based on an idea in a book written by Jack Vizard, who was another one of the PCA members. He wrote it in 1970 after the code was over.
Yeah.
But on one of the pages, he mentioned this idea that Mr. Breen had, and he told him, but he didn't act on it, unfortunately. It's called, he referred to it as the Legion of Scriveners. It's an idea about people writing letters to the studio, but through an organization. So you have letters they could copy to tell people to tell the filmmakers of their concern about specific films and just their desire for decency. He told them that idea in 1951, and he thought that it could help keep the code strong because he was planning on retiring. He thought it could help keep the code strong to tell the filmmakers in a very direct way, because he said, especially if it were important people, from people who owned companies and influential people, that would show the filmmakers that it was something that the people really wanted. And so my idea is that I will be able to, I've already started the website, I just have a few more steps to try to get it ready, but I hope I'll be able to, and when I do, I'll advertise it on my website. It's part of the greater clean movie movement, which has the three branches: the Pure Entertainment Preservation Society, ultimately the Legion of Scriveners, and also the LA Soprani Sisters. It's a singing group that my sister and I started. We've only been able to put on one concert, but I'm hoping that someday we'll be able to be hired to sing different organizations. And we have programs of classical songs where we sing, tell stories about classic Hollywood and decency and the need for purity and traditionalism in opera and other things as well as film. So those are the three main branches we have, but right now the only one that's really doing anything is PEPS.
Okay, well, good. Well, even go back to the money thing, it's not just about that they want money. They have to know there's an audience, because everything's a business.
That's right.
So if they see there's a real audience for this, then hopefully they'll give it due consideration. I just got to ask, is there any one film that doesn't meet the code that you really wish did, because you think it's a really good film and you just really wish it had met the code?
You mean one made during the Breen era or from another period?
No, one anywhere between the, even early 30s through the late 50s.
Okay, let's see. Footlight Parade from 1933 is a pre-code film, and I do really like that one because it's one of the only musicals James Cagney ever made, and he is one of my favorite actors, and I really like that movie because it has some great elements. There are some good songs, but they just went berserk with the costumes and that I really like. I mentioned Lou Ayres was the actor we liked to kind of start it. He made a lot of really, really good movies from the early pre-code era because he made his debut in a silent film in 1929, and so you kind of would wish that some of those, like Night World, 1932, State Fair, 1933, even his gangster film he made in 1930 called Doorway to Hell. They didn't have titles like that during the code, but it's a really dramatic story. It's just 1 hour long, but so impacting. It would have needed quite a bit of work, but there was something really good about it. And Grand Hotel is a really famous one from 1932 that it's not, I mean, there are a lot of problems with it, but there also is something great about it. It is a masterpiece in its own way, and it's interesting that the two Barrymore brothers are in it, and Greta Garbo and everything. So I like that one. Let's see about latest Sherlock. I know there are a lot of, I really like Jack Lemmon from the 50s. He was our favorite actor before Lou Ayres. So I'd say some movies from there.
Yeah, but The Apartment, I guess, would not exactly be, or would The Apartment be considered code compliant?
The Apartment?
Yeah, with Jack Lemmon.
Yeah, that's from 1960, and it is a Sherlock era film, and it's interesting because you have the two movies Jack Lemmon made with Billy Wilder right around then. You have Some Like It Hot from 1959,
right,
and The Apartment from 1960. Now, they were different. One was a goofy comedy that had some really strange things, and the other one was a pretty serious drama. The Apartment is better, I think, artistically, because it's more along the lines of, say, Sunset Boulevard from 10 years earlier. The serious side that you forget that Billy Wilder even had a serious side when you just watch his goofy Sherlock movies like Some Like It Hot and Irma la Douce. You think of him as just a goofball, but he actually could be really dramatic and sensitive when he was younger during the code. but could it have been? I actually think that The Apartment is almost unbrainable. Meaning, it couldn't have been a code film. It could,
Right.
but it would be a real stretch because what's the basic premise? A man climbs the industrial ladder by loaning his apartment to higher ups in the company, and the question is to do what? I mean,
Right.
it sounds like I mean, it's pretty obvious they're bringing over mistresses to have affairs in his apartment. If you get rid of that, all you've got is a fellow who's in an insurance company and he likes an elevator operator. I think I sort of said in one article how you could have done that. I think I said that you could have had it that Fran Kubelik, it's Shirley MacLaine's character, doesn't know that, what's his name, Fred Murray's character, is married, so she isn't, and make it seem less like she's having an affair with him, like she's just having, I don't know, secret rendezvous with him. But the main element of The Apartment, I mean, he would have to be doing something. Oh, I know what I said. I said it would have to be something like they're having gambling or something in his apartment, having like a floating crap game. It would have to be something like that. You'd have to get rid of the basic element because that basic element is very suggestive. Now, if it had been made 10 years later, it wouldn't have just been suggestive. You would have seen things very blatantly. Yep. But there also is attempted suicide with sleeping pills, which they usually didn't like to show, and a pretty flippant discussion of suicide. There's a lot profanity, which there isn't in Some Like It Hot. It's funny, in the late 50s, only a few movies from the late 50s contain, and there were only 2 words that they would allow, darn and heck, if you will. And those are the only words they really allowed a lot in Sherlock films up until about 1960. And then after that, they started including those a lot more, and eventually they started putting the worst words in. But that is like I said, it's a better film, I think, than Some Like It Hot. And back about 4, maybe more like 5 years ago, Jack Lemmon was our favorite actor, so we watched The Apartment and Some Like It Hot all the time, like every couple of weeks, because Rebecca and I just really liked him. But so I say The Apartment and other Jack Lemmon films, The Notorious Landlady from 1962, movies like that, they're good because Jack Lemmon was a really good actor, and you kind of find yourself wondering, why did they have to do this? But he only made one code film in his whole career. His first movie, It Should Happen to You, from 1954. After that, it was just... Well, I even wrote a whole article on their website about how Jack Lemmon's career shows the path of the Sherlock era, how you can see in the 50s and the 60s how films were changing just by looking at his movies.
Oh, that's interesting. Have you ever had someone confront you to say, all these old operas or all these things, we need to modernize them to get more people interested in them, or we want to show a different way so that way we're opening up the arts more? Have you ever had that sort of argument presented to you? And what's kind of your response to that? Yeah,
a lot of people have said that, and I have said, well, it's one thing to show a different perspective, but now it's come to the point that young people have never even seen the right way. It's not an alternate, it's not like another option, it's the only option. And there comes to a point of artistic integrity. I mean, if you want to have a new staging, that's one thing, but if you're setting something that was written, like the Marriage of Figaro, if you're setting something that was set in the old Spanish court in a hotel in San Diego, for one thing, if you have any translation, it doesn't make much sense. It takes a lot of liberties with it. I'm all for doing a different take on something. I like it when they'll take a novel and then make a movie of it and even put it in a different setting. I think that can be very creative and very interesting. But with opera, the music is written. If you change it, you're changing the words, you're translating it to English sometimes, and pretty soon it's not even the same thing. I think you should... I personally don't agree with that kind of thing. I think it's better to encourage people to write new things, but if you do that, you must have the other option. Here is the good Marriage of Figaro, the traditional way, and here's the crazy version in San Diego. Give your audience both options. Perform them side by side. I think people would be curious to see both. Maybe even have a package deal where you could buy 2 tickets for discounted rates, where you can see the traditional version and the modernized version. I know people are wanting to do more modern things, but they've gone so far now that it's even productions which are supposed to be traditional aren't traditional because they put in modern humor. So they're trying to compete with Hollywood, but they never can because opera is an old art form. So in trying to draw in young people who don't even like opera, they're losing the old crowd, and they're not making a new crowd. So I've heard so many people who said, I'm canceling my Met subscription. I've come to the Met every year for the last 40 years, but I'm not going to come anymore. Now, yes, I mean, how much longer can that person keep coming? Well, maybe only another 10 years, but still, that's the crowd, and maybe those people will bring the grandchildren, and they could learn to love traditional opera. So I think it comes to the point that it's like modern films. It started out, well, we want to have mature films and decent films, but within about 5 years, there were no more decent films, or very few. All of a sudden, it's like one or the other, and that's the way human nature seems to be in the arts. It can't be traditional and experimental. It can't be daring and decent. I mean, how many G-rated films are made? Almost none. So that's kind of how it is with opera. Now, like, ballets are a little different because the choreography isn't written down. It's mind-boggling as a musician to see how they just either remember it or watch it off videos. And I kind of wonder how they were able to do that before the age of YouTube. But because of that, there's a lot more freedom with changing things, and I don't agree with doing something crazy like setting Swan Lake in, well, there was a version of Swan Lake from Australia where Rothbard, who was this male villain, was a female character. I think that kind of messed up the story, so I don't really agree with that. Of course, the one exception is the Nutcracker. Everybody kind of does his own strange take on it because it wasn't a huge success when it first was put on in the 1890s, so everyone does a new take, and it can get a little out of hand, yet it's sort of, nobody really does it right, so everybody's equal. Like my student's ballet studio, I'm part of the production too. I mean, she's in it. She's been in the last couple of years, and when we first went to this ballet studio about 2.5 years ago, I didn't like the idea that the director was saying how he had this new version of how he had his special version of the Nutcracker. And it's like, I don't like that modernizing. But then as it encouraged Rebecca and me to do some real research on what the Nutcracker is, and we discovered what we know as the traditional Nutcracker isn't the original Nutcracker from the 1890s. Everybody has done it differently. There's the Balanchine version. There's the ABT version. Everybody has his own take, so even if what you know is traditional, even that isn't traditional. So, I mean, this gentleman, Mark Erickson, the director, he's almost more, if he gave it a new name, I would say he's actually written almost a new ballet on the Nutcracker because he includes 2 different pieces of music. So that's the one exception. But other than that, he doesn't modernize other things. So I think it's always good to try to do research for yourself to see, is somebody just being creative or is he going too far? Right. In the case of Mr. Erickson, I don't think that he is going too far because the Nutcracker is sort of fair game, but when he put on another production like Giselle, he was extremely traditional. Right. So with opera, it's like the Met is the worst. LA Opera is probably second.
Oh, man.
New York City Opera and San Diego Opera are comparable in the fact that they don't have as much money. They're more likely to do really social significant or bizarre pieces than putting on traditional operas and just doing them strangely. Like at the Met, they put on Rigoletto, which is about this evil duke and this young lady, and they set it in Las Vegas in the 1960s. And he's wearing, you see all these flashing lights, and then they say it was choreographed or by Tony Award winner or Academy Award winner. It just shows they're bringing in Broadway people and they're bringing in Hollywood people, and that's just not what opera is supposed to be. So as a result, I mean, I'd always thought I'd be an opera singer, but now I really wonder if I'm ever going to be able to perform in professional opera. I still hope. I mean, just like I hope the code's going to come back. Right. I hope there'll be some sort of a revival of traditional, or maybe even I hope we can start our own arts foundation someday. But yeah, I hope that there will be a revival of at least going side by side, so that people can have an option that we don't, like modern actors. Now you basically can't be an actor if you're not willing to be nude on screen or do compromising things. It's almost become the same thing with opera, even to the point of nudity on stage.
Well, there is also an idea that sometimes if you want to, quote unquote, modernize something or change it a little bit, if you really do know and respect the material, sometimes there are maybe a slight change you might make because if you don't think the audience will be able to get certain things, but it's still within the spirit of what was done versus just taking things and just, no, we have to modernize it, and then you put 21st century thought onto something that's from the 1800s, that doesn't necessarily translate. That doesn't translate the other way of staying faithful to what this, the spirit of this, whatever the story is, or, just because you might have changed the dress doesn't mean you have to go into something doesn't mean you have to give them tank top and shorts. It just means that you might have slightly altered the dress just because of color blocking or something. So that is a difference. Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, there's so much more really to speak about on this, but we're gonna have to wrap up just because we went way over the time we usually spend on these bonus episodes. I always end off, so we'll see if we could. I kind of warned you about this, that we always end up with a sort of fill in the blank, and you can approach this from any angle that you have the answer for. So if there's one thing that you can say, I love it when either film or stories or studios do X, and it can be from a technical point of view, from a story point of view, or an actor does X, anything like that. And then also, I really don't like it when they do X. So if you could fill in those blanks, it could be something we spoke about or just something else already, just a personal preference.
Okay. Let's see. I love it when filmmakers will take a story that has some good elements, but it has certain elements so that it seems like it couldn't possibly be made into a movie, especially during the code, but then they do it, and they do such a great job that it's almost better than the book.
Wow.
And I don't like it when they take a story, and this isn't really from a code perspective, I don't like it when they take a story that would have been brilliant if they put it on the screen exactly as it was in the book, or almost, and then they do it completely differently. I think sometimes there are many old books I've read or things where it would have been great if they had done it in a more traditional way, but they felt like being more creative and kind of writing their own story, and that sometimes I think it's a shame when they did that. Like She from 1935. Yeah. I think that there could have been such a good movie adaptation of She by H. Rider Haggard, and no one's ever really done it justice, but I think they could have done a great classic one, but when they did it in 35, they changed the setting to the Arctic instead of Africa, so I don't think they even really tried on that one.
Yeah. Well, actually, as a writer, I can tell you that the second thing that you said, I don't like it when they change the book to the film. I think most people agree with you on that, but I got to ask the follow-up before we sign off. I got to ask you the follow-up on the first one. Is there a story that you can think of that was better on film than the book that you're thinking of, or you're just saying that as a general idea?
Offhand, I'd say Grapes of Wrath. I'm not saying it isn't a good book, but I haven't read the book, but I've read the overview, but I've heard a lot of people say the book was so dismal I could barely get through it, but I loved the movie, because they kept the spirit while toning down the bleakness just enough and giving it a note of hope at the end, because the book just ends with the woman having a baby and who's stillborn, and it's just so bleak. It's like everybody's dead or just drifted away. It leaves you just thinking that there's absolutely no hope in life, but the movie just ended it on a positive note and left you thinking, I watched it right after the beginning of the lockdown, and I was really depressed, and somehow when that ending with Ma saying, we'll just keep going because we're the people, I kind of felt, our problems aren't that bad, I can keep going, seeing how these people kept going. So I think they did such a good job of taking a book that they said couldn't ever be a movie, and they made it into a great movie.
Okay, good answer. Okay, well, Tiffany, thank you so much for joining us, and we really appreciate it. It was so interesting, and we'll have the link for your website will be in the episode notes, so everyone can check out what you're doing and join the talk and join the voices that say, yes, clean it up.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
This was a bonus episode of Oh My Word podcast featuring Tiffany Brannan. To find out more about Tiffany and her work, please look at the link in the episode notes. Follow Oh My Word podcast on Instagram or find out more about us at www.eltenenbaum.com. Thanks for joining us. See you next time.